The war you never saw coming. How information became the most powerful weapon on Earth. Most people believe wars are loud. They imagine explosions, collapsing buildings, soldiers marching through smoke-filled streets. History books are full of these images, and for centuries, war looked exactly like that. But the most important war of the modern era didn't begin with gunfire. It began quietly. No sit-ins, no emergency broadcasts, no official declaration. It began inside screens, inside algorithms, inside policies written in language so clean and polite that almost no one questioned them. By the time people sensed something had changed, the battlefield was already built, and they were standing in the middle of it. This is the war Mike Benz calmly describes in the Joe Rogan Experience, number 2447. And once you understand it, you realize something unsettling. You didn't miss the beginning of this war. You were never meant to see it. A new kind of battlefield. In the 20th century, power was measured in armies, weapons, and territory. In the 21st century, power is measured in attention. Who controls what people see? Who decides what spreads? Who determines which ideas feel normal and which feel dangerous? Mike Benz doesn't frame this as a conspiracy or a sudden shift. He explains it as an evolution. Governments didn't wake up one day and decide to manipulate information. They adapted to a new environment. When social media platforms emerged, they weren't just tools for connection. They were something far more significant, global perception engines. And perception, when scaled to billions of people, becomes power. Joe Rogan listens closely as Benz explains how influence operations moved away from persuasion and toward environment shaping. You don't need to convince someone of a specific belief if you can control the range of beliefs they ever encounter. That's the key difference. Old propaganda told people what to think. Modern influence decides what thinking is even possible. The shift nobody announced. There was no press conference announcing this change. No headline that read, "Welcome to the information war era." Instead, the shift arrived disguised as responsibility. Platforms began talking about safety, trust, integrity, harm reduction. Each word sounded reasonable, necessary even, but as Mike Benz explains, these terms slowly became policy gateways. They allowed decisions about visibility, reach, and legitimacy to be made behind closed doors, without public debate. Joe Rogan raises a critical point. Most people assume censorship means deletion. Benz corrects him. Deletion is crude. Deletion creates backlash. Modern systems don't delete ideas. They derank them. They slow them down. They limit their spread. They quietly remove them from recommendation systems. Nothing feels taken from you. The idea still exists somewhere. It just stops mattering. When war becomes invisible. Traditional war relies on fear and force. This war relies on normalization. Mike Benz describes how information control works best when it feels boring. When it's technical, when it's framed as maintenance rather than enforcement. Most people don't read platform policy updates. They don't question algorithm changes. They don't track which topics suddenly stop trending. They just adapt. Joe realizes something profound during the conversation. This war doesn't need public support. It only needs public disengagement. If people stop paying attention, the system runs smoothly. And it has. The role of platforms, not villains, not heroes. One of the most important clarifications Benz makes is that platforms themselves aren't necessarily evil. They're pressure points. Governments, NGOs, and institutions realize something crucial. Controlling platforms directly would create backlash, but influencing their incentives would not. Regulatory threats, public pressure, advertiser concerns, reputation risks. These forces quietly shape platform behavior without a single explicit order being given. Joe Rogan points out how often tech executives claim they're just following expert guidance. Benz explains why that phrase matters. Experts don't appear magically. They're selected, funded, endorsed. And once an expert class is established, platforms can claim neutrality while enforcing decisions that align perfectly with institutional interests. No one feels responsible, which means no one can be held accountable. From persuasion to confusion. One of the most disturbing ideas in this episode is that modern influence doesn't aim to convince. It aims to disorient. Mike Benz explains that when populations are overwhelmed with conflicting narratives, they don't become informed. They become exhausted. Exhausted people don't resist. They withdraw. Joe connects this to something he's noticed for years. People increasingly say, "I don't know what to believe anymore." That sentence sounds harmless. It isn't. When truth feels unreachable, authority becomes attractive. When uncertainty becomes painful, people outsource thinking to systems that promise stability. That's not accidental. That's strategy. NGOs, the quiet architects. The conversation takes a darker turn when Benz begins explaining the role of NGOs. Non-governmental organizations sound independent, neutral, even benevolent, and many of them do genuinely positive work. But some function as policy intermediaries. Here's how the system works. Governments face legal and constitutional limits. Platforms fear public backlash. NGOs fill the gap. They produce reports. They label risks. They define threats. Platforms then point to those reports as justification for action. Governments deny involvement. Platforms deny bias. NGOs deny power. Joe Rogan pauses, clearly unsettled, because once you see the structure, you realize how clean it is. No villains, no orders, just incentives aligning quietly. War without enemies. Traditional war needs an enemy. This war doesn't. It frames itself as protection from abstractions, misinformation, extremism, harmful narratives, threats to democracy. Who could oppose that? Mike Benz explains that once the enemy becomes abstract, anyone can be framed as a risk. Questions become threats. Doubt becomes danger. Skepticism becomes harm. Joe asks the question many listeners are thinking. When did questioning things become suspicious? There is no clear answer, only a timeline. And that's what makes it effective. Why this war is so hard to fight. You can protest a war you can see. You can oppose laws you can read. But how do you resist systems you don't fully understand? Mike Benz emphasizes that this war thrives on complexity. The more technical it sounds, the less people engage. The more bureaucratic it feels, the more it fades into the background. Joe notes that even discussing these topics often triggers accusations of paranoia. Benz responds calmly. That reaction is part of the system. When awareness itself is framed as danger, most people choose comfort over clarity. The psychological cost. This isn't just about politics. It's about psychology. Living inside an information environment that constantly signals danger, instability, and moral urgency changes how people think. It shortens attention spans. It reduces curiosity. It increases conformity. Joe reflects on how many people feel permanently anxious but can't explain why. Mike Benz explains that constant low-level fear is more effective than panic. Panic burns out. Fear settles in. And settled fear keeps people manageable. No grand finale, no victory parade. This episode doesn't end with solutions. There is no rallying cry, no dramatic call to action. That's intentional, because this war doesn't end with victory or defeat. It continues quietly, adjusting, evolving, adapting. Mike Benz leaves listeners with something more unsettling than fear. awareness. Once you understand how information power works, you stop seeing the world the same way. Headlines feel different. Platform changes feel intentional. Silence feels meaningful. Joe Rogan doesn't try to wrap it up neatly. He lets the weight of it sit. The question that changes everything. If this war is real, if information is the battlefield, if attention is the weapon, then the most important question isn't who is winning. It's this: are you choosing what you see, or is it being chosen for you? And once that question enters your mind, there's no going back. The illusion of free speech in the digital age. Why you're still allowed to speak, but fewer people hear you. There has never been a time in history when people felt more free to speak. You can post instantly, comment publicly, upload videos, share opinions with the world. And yet, something feels off. People talk more than ever, but feel less heard than ever. That contradiction sits at the heart of Joe Rogan Experience, number 2447, with Mike Benz. Not as an accusation, not as a rant, but as a quiet observation that slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Free speech, Benz suggests, didn't disappear. It evolved, and in that evolution, it became something far more difficult to detect. The old idea of censorship is dead. When most people think of censorship, they imagine something obvious. Books burned, accounts banned, voices silenced by force. That still happens in some parts of the world. But that's not how control works in modern digital societies. Mike Benz explains that outright censorship is inefficient. It creates backlash. It draws attention. It invites resistance. Modern systems don't silence speech. They manage visibility. Joe Rogan stops him there. So, you're saying free speech technically still exists? Benz nods. Yes, and that's exactly why it works. Speaking isn't the same as being heard. Here's the core illusion. You're allowed to speak. You're allowed to post. You're allowed to upload. But reach is no longer yours. Reach is filtered. Every platform runs on algorithms designed to prioritize, suppress, or ignore content based on criteria you don't control and rarely understand. Mike Benz explains this shift with unsettling clarity. In the past, if you stood in a public square and spoke loudly enough, people would hear you. Today, you can speak to millions, but only if the system decides your voice is relevant. Joe Rogan reflects on how often creators say the same thing. My content didn't change. My audience didn't change. But suddenly no one sees it. That isn't coincidence. That's design. Algorithms as invisible editors. Editors used to be human. They worked at newspapers, TV stations, publishing houses. You could criticize them, replace them, or compete with them. Algorithms are different. They don't argue. They don't explain. They don't take responsibility. Mike Benz describes algorithms as invisible editors, making millions of micro decisions every second about what deserves attention. What feels organic is often engineered. What feels unpopular may simply be unseen. Joe points out the psychological impact of this realization. If people believe their ideas are unpopular, they self-censor. They stop posting. They stop questioning. They stop exploring uncomfortable thoughts. No rule is enforced. Compliance happens voluntarily. The power of deranking. One of the most important concepts in this episode is deranking. Deranking doesn't remove content. It doesn't notify the user. It doesn't break any rules on paper. It simply ensures fewer people encounter the content. Mike Benz explains why this method is so effective. Deleted content creates martyrs. Deranked content creates silence. Joe Rogan notes how this aligns perfectly with platform incentives. Less controversy, less noise, less risk. The user doesn't protest because nothing obvious was taken. They just disappear. Free speech as a technicality. This is where the illusion becomes complete. Legally, free speech remains intact. Constitutionally, rights are preserved. Publicly, platforms insist they support expression. But practically, speech without reach is like a voice without air. That isn't coincidence. That's design. Algorithms as invisible editors. Editors used to be human. They worked at newspapers, TV stations, publishing houses. You could criticize them, replace them, or compete with them. Algorithms are different. They don't argue. They don't explain. They don't take responsibility. Mike Benz describes algorithms as invisible editors, making millions of micro decisions every second about what deserves attention. What feels organic is often engineered. What feels unpopular may simply be unseen. Joe points out the psychological impact of this realization. If people believe their ideas are unpopular, they self-censor. They stop posting. They stop questioning. They stop exploring uncomfortable thoughts. No rule is enforced. Compliance happens voluntarily. The power of deranking. One of the most important concepts in this episode is deranking. Deranking doesn't remove content. It doesn't notify the user. It doesn't break any rules on paper. It simply ensures fewer people encounter the content. Mike Benz explains why this method is so effective. Deleted content creates martyrs. Deranked content creates silence. Joe Rogan notes how this aligns perfectly with platform incentives. Less controversy, less noise, less risk. The user doesn't protest because nothing obvious was taken. They just disappear. Free speech as a technicality. This is where the illusion becomes complete. Legally, free speech remains intact. Constitutionally, rights are preserved. Publicly, platforms insist they support expression. But practically, speech without reach is like a voice without air. Mike Benz explains that modern free speech has become procedural, not functional. You're allowed to speak, but the system decides whether your speech matters. Joe Rogan sits with that for a moment, because that distinction changes everything. When popularity is manufactured, another unsettling idea emerges midway through the conversation. What if popularity itself is no longer organic? Mike Benz explains how algorithms don't just reflect trends, they create them. When platforms amplify certain narratives, those narratives gain social proof. People assume they're widely accepted, and humans follow perceived majority opinion. Joe points out how often people say, "Everyone thinks this," without realizing that everyone often means everyone the algorithm showed me. That's not consensus. That's curation. The psychological trap of visibility. Visibility is addictive. Likes, shares, views, comments. These signals don't just measure engagement. They shape behavior. Mike Benz explains that creators quickly learn what the system rewards. Over time, they adjust their speech, not because they were forced to, but because they want to be seen. Joe Rogan recognizes this pattern across all platforms. People don't ask, "Is this true?" They ask, "Will this perform?" And that subtle shift has enormous consequences. Truth becomes optional. Performance becomes essential. The chilling effect without fear. Traditional censorship relies on fear. Modern suppression relies on ambiguity. Mike Benz explains that when people don't know why their content stops spreading, they blame themselves. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe the topic wasn't interesting. Maybe they crossed an invisible line. That uncertainty is powerful. Joe notes that uncertainty creates self-discipline. People internalize the system's preferences without ever being told what they are. No punishment required. Experts trust in delegated authority. Platforms rarely claim direct authority over truth, but they decide which experts decide what's true. That distinction doesn't reduce power. It concentrates it. The disappearance of context. Another subtle but devastating shift is the loss of context. Algorithms don't evaluate ideas in full conversations. They evaluate keywords, patterns, associations. Mike Benz explains how complex arguments are flattened into signals. Nuance disappears. Irony disappears. Exploration disappears. Joe reflects on how often good faith discussions are misclassified as dangerous simply because they touch sensitive topics. The result? People avoid complexity, and complexity is where understanding lies. Free speech versus safe speech. By this point in the episode, the conversation has moved beyond technology. It's about values. Mike Benz explains that modern systems increasingly prioritize safe speech over free speech. Speech that aligns with accepted narratives is promoted. Speech that challenges them is treated as risky. Joe Rogan observes that this creates a culture where curiosity itself feels dangerous. Questions become liabilities. And when questions disappear, progress follows. The cost of silence. This isn't just about suppressed voices. It's about lost ideas. Mike Benz emphasizes that some of the most important insights in history were once unpopular. If modern systems had existed earlier, many transformative ideas might never have reached the public. Joe sits quietly as that realization lands. Innovation requires friction. Truth requires challenge. Understanding requires disagreement. Algorithms don't value those things. They value stability. Why people don't notice. The most unsettling part of this illusion is how comfortable it feels. There are no soldiers, no police, no visible forces, just smooth interfaces and pleasant notifications. Mike Benz explains that people don't resist systems that entertain them. As long as feeds feel engaging, few people question how they're curated. Joe Rogan points out that distraction might be the most powerful control mechanism of all. The final illusion. By the end of this conversation, one truth becomes clear. Free speech wasn't taken away. It was reframed. You're free to speak, but only within an environment designed to minimize disruption. You're free to express, but only if your expression aligns with system incentives. And because nothing feels overtly oppressive, most people never question it. The question that lingers. Mike Benz doesn't tell people what to do. Joe Rogan doesn't give instructions. They leave listeners with a single, uncomfortable question. If you can speak freely, but no one hears you, are you truly free? And once that question enters your mind, every scroll feels different. Who decides what is true? Inside the rise of narrative authority, there was a time when truth didn't need permission. Facts were discovered, debated, challenged, and refined in public. Disagreement was not treated as danger. It was treated as progress. Being wrong was part of learning. Being curious was not suspicious. That world feels distant now. In the Joe Rogan Experience number 2447, Mike Benz doesn't say this directly. He doesn't need to. The realization emerges slowly, layer by layer, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Truth, in the modern world, is no longer something we arrive at. It's something we are clear to accept, and that shift changes everything. When truth stops being discovered, Joe Rogan opens this part of the conversation the way he often does, by noticing a pattern. People aren't arguing about facts anymore. They're arguing about who is allowed to speak. Mike Benz leans into that observation and explains why it matters. In healthy systems, truth emerges through competition. Ideas collide. Evidence is tested. The strongest explanations survive not because they are approved, but because they hold up. But modern information systems don't prioritize resilience. They prioritize stability. And stability requires control over narrative boundaries. Not lies. Boundaries. The birth of narrative authority. Narrative authority is not the same as propaganda. Propaganda tells you what to believe. Narrative authority decides which beliefs are acceptable. Mike Benz explains that modern institutions don't need to manufacture falsehoods. They simply need to decide which interpretations are legitimate. Once legitimacy is controlled, dissent becomes deviance. Joe Rogan pauses here, recognizing the subtlety of this shift. Because narrative authority doesn't shout, it certifies, from evidence to endorsement. One of the most profound changes Benz outlines is the shift from evidence-based truth to endorsement-based truth. In the past, claims were evaluated on merit. Today, they are often evaluated on source approval. Who said it? Are they verified? Are they trusted? Are they aligned? Joe notes how often people dismiss information not by engaging with it, but by labeling its origin. That's not a credible source. Mike Benz explains why that phrase has become so powerful. It ends conversation without addressing content. Trust as a centralized resource. Trust used to be personal. You trusted people you knew. Institutions earned trust over time through performance. Now, trust is increasingly centralized. Platforms, institutions, and media outlets tell you who to trust and who not to. Mike Benz explains that once trust becomes centralized, it becomes manageable. Joe Rogan recognizes the danger immediately. If trust is outsourced, so is judgment. The role of fact-checkers. Fact-checkers sound neutral. That's intentional. Mike Benz carefully explains how fact-checking evolved from verification into interpretation enforcement. Fact-checkers don't always say something is false. More often, they label it misleading, lacking context, potentially harmful. Joe points out how vague those terms are. Benz agrees. Vagueness allows flexibility. Flexibility allows power. When context becomes a weapon, context is essential for understanding, but can also be used to invalidate. Mike Benz explains how complex claims are often dismissed not because they're wrong, but because they lack proper context. Joe sees the problem instantly. Who decides what context is sufficient? And who decides when context becomes complete enough to allow discussion? There are no clear answers, only systems. The fear of being wrong. One of the most psychologically revealing moments in the episode is when Benz discusses fear. Not fear of punishment, fear of being wrong in public. Joe Rogan observes that people today are terrified of saying the wrong thing, even in good faith. Mike Benz explains why. When truth is treated as fragile, mistakes become dangerous. When mistakes are dangerous, curiosity dies. And when curiosity dies, authority thrives. The collapse of open inquiry. Open inquiry requires tolerance for uncertainty. But modern narrative systems treat uncertainty as risk. Mike Benz explains that many institutions now prefer premature certainty over honest ambiguity. It feels safer. It looks more responsible. Joe points out the irony. Some of the greatest scientific and philosophical breakthroughs came from uncertainty. Benz nods. Those breakthroughs required freedom to be wrong. Misinformation as a moral threat. One of the most powerful narrative shifts discussed in this episode is the moralization of information. Mike Benz explains that misinformation is no longer framed as incorrect. It's framed as harmful. Joe understands the implication immediately. If information causes harm, then controlling it becomes moral. And moral authority doesn't require justification. The expansion of harm. Originally, harm referred to direct physical damage. Now, harm includes emotional discomfort, social destabilization, loss of trust, questioning authority. Mike Benz explains that once harm becomes psychological or abstract, anything can qualify. Joe reflects on how often people say, that idea is dangerous, without explaining why. Danger has become a conclusion, not a claim. Expertise without accountability. Experts play a central role in narrative authority. Mike Benz explains that experts today often wield enormous influence without corresponding accountability. They are not elected. They are rarely challenged. They are protected by credentials. Joe Rogan asks the obvious question, what happens when experts are wrong? Benz answers calmly, the system doesn't collapse. It adjusts the narrative. Consensus as performance. Consensus used to emerge naturally. Now it is often performed. Mike Benz explains that dissenting voices are often allowed to exist, but isolated. They are framed as fringe, extreme, or irresponsible. Joe recognizes the pattern. Once a view is framed as fringe, engaging with it becomes socially risky. Most people don't take that risk. Why truth feels fragile now? Truth feels fragile because it's treated as fragile. Mike Benz explains that systems which fear open debate signal weakness. Strong truths survive challenge. Weak narratives require protection. Joe Rogan sits quietly as that idea settles. Protection doesn't build confidence. It reveals insecurity. The cost of delegated thinking. When people stop thinking for themselves, they don't become stupid. They become dependent. Mike Benz explains that dependency is the ultimate goal of narrative authority, not obedience, dependence. Joe Rogan notes how often people ask, what am I allowed to believe? That question would have sounded absurd decades ago. Now it feels normal. Why people accept it? Narrative authority doesn't feel oppressive. It feels relieving. Thinking is hard. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Responsibility is heavy. When systems promise clarity and safety, many people accept the trade. Joe Rogan understands this deeply. People don't give up freedom because they hate it. They give it up because they're tired. The final shift. By the end of this conversation, one truth becomes unavoidable. Truth has moved from being a destination to being a permission structure. You don't ask, is this true? You ask, is this allowed? And once that, Joe Rogan doesn't call for rebellion. They leave listeners with a single, unsettling question. If truth requires approval, who approves the approvers? And once that question enters your mind, every claim sounds different.
The NGO shadow network, the middlemen of modern power. No one voted for most people believe power lives in obvious places: governments, presidents, parliaments, elections. That belief is comforting. It suggests that power is visible, accountable, and ultimately answerable to the public. But in the Joe Rogan Experience number 2447, Mike Benz quietly dismantles that assumption, not with accusations, but with a structure. Because some of the most influential forces in the modern world don't campaign, don't govern, and don't appear on ballots. They operate in the space between authority and responsibility. They are called NGOs. And once you understand how they function, the modern system of power looks very different. The innocent image. Non-governmental organizations sound harmless, charitable, academic, humanitarian, neutral. When people hear NGO, they imagine disaster relief, education programs, or human rights advocacy. Many NGOs do exactly that work. Mike Benz is careful to make this distinction early. The issue is not that NGOs exist. The issue is how they are used. Joe Rogan leans in as Benz explains that NGOs have become the perfect intermediaries for modern influence because they carry credibility without accountability. They are trusted, but rarely audited. influential but unelected, powerful but legally distant. That combination is not accidental. Why governments need middlemen? Governments face limits, legal limits, constitutional limits, political limits. There are things governments cannot do directly, especially in democratic societies, without triggering a backlash, lawsuits, or public outrage. Mike Benz explains that NGOs solve this problem elegantly. If a government funds an NGO, and that NGO produces research, and that research recommends action, and platforms follow that recommendation, the government never touched the decision. Joe Rogan pauses, because that means power can be exercised without fingerprints. Policy laundering. Explained Benz introduces a term that stops the conversation cold. Policy laundering. It works like this. A policy goal originates inside a government or institution. Instead of implementing it directly, funding is routed to NGOs. NGOs publish reports framing the issue as urgent or dangerous. Platforms cite those reports to justify enforcement. Media references the NGO as an independent authority. Every step looks legitimate. No single actor appears responsible. Joe Rogan realizes what makes this so effective. There's no villain to protest. Expertise without accountability. NGOs are often staffed by experts. That's their strength and their shield. Experts don't need elections. They don't need campaigns. They don't need public approval. Mike Benz explains that once expertise becomes the basis of authority, accountability quietly disappears. Joe Rogan asks a simple question. Who checks them? The answer is uncomfortable. Very few people. The trust pipeline. One of the most revealing moments in the episode is when Benz explains the trust pipeline. Platforms don't want to decide what's true. Governments don't want to appear controlling a speech. Media doesn't want legal risk, so trust is outsourced to NGOs. Once an NGO is designated trusted, its output flows freely through the system. Joe sees the danger immediately. If trust is centralized, it can be captured. When neutrality becomes influence, NGOs rarely issue commands. They issue warnings, potential risks, emerging threats, concerning trends. Mike Benz explains that warnings are far more powerful than directives. They don't force action, they justify it. Joe Rogan notes how often platforms say they're acting out of caution. Caution sounds responsible, but caution, when guided by selective expertise, becomes control. The feedback loop nobody sees. Here's where the system becomes self-reinforcing. NGOs publish reports. Platforms act on those reports. Media reports on platform actions. NGOs cite media coverage as validation. The loop closes. Joe Rogan sits quietly as the realization lands. The system doesn't need truth. It needs momentum. Funding and influence. Benz carefully explains that funding matters. NGOs don't operate in a vacuum. They require grants, donations, and institutional support. Funding doesn't always dictate conclusions, but it shapes priorities. Joe Rogan connects this to something intuitive. People rarely bite the hand that feeds them. That doesn't require corruption, just alignment. The appearance of consensus. When multiple NGOs publish similar findings, it looks like consensus. Mike Benz explains why that can be misleading. Often, these organizations share funding sources, networks, or advisory boards. Their agreement may reflect coordination, not independent discovery. Joe points out how powerful that illusion is. Consensus ends debate. Why the public doesn't push back? Most people don't oppose NGOs. Why would they? They aren't visible. They aren't political. On the surface, they speak in technical language. Miki Benz explains that complexity is a defense mechanism. The more abstract the issue, the fewer people engage. Joe Rogan notes that people tend to trust what they don't understand, especially if it sounds professional. NGOs and platforms. A perfect match. Platforms need cover. NGOs need reach. Mike Benz explains how this mutual dependency created a powerful alliance. Platforms point to NGOs as justification. NGOs gain relevance through platform enforcement. Neither claims authority, both exercise it. The global dimension. This isn't limited to one country. Benz explains how NGOs operate across borders, influencing policies globally while avoiding national accountability. Joe Rogan realizes the scale of this: power without borders, influence without elections, authority without consent. When good intentions aren't enough. Mike Benz is careful not to demonize individuals. Many people inside NGOs genuinely believe they're doing good. But systems don't run on intentions. They run on incentives. Joe Rogan nods. History is full of harm caused by well-intentioned systems. The democratic blind spot democracy assumes power is visible. NGOs exploit that assumption. They don't govern, they advise, they recommend, they assess. But recommendations shape reality. Joe Rogan asks the question that hangs in the air. If they have this much influence, why aren't they accountable? There's no clean answer. Why this matters more than ever. In an age where information is power, those who shape information shape outcomes. Mike Benz explains that NGOs have become gatekeepers of legitimacy. Once labeled dangerous, misinformation, or harmful, an idea struggles to survive, regardless of its accuracy. Joe realizes something unsettling. Truth now passes through institutions before reaching people. The quiet shift of authority didn't disappear. It relocated from elected officials to experts to organizations to systems. Each step reduced visibility. Each step reduced accountability. Joe Rogan reflects on how few people even know this shift occurred. That's the point. No villains, no heroes. This isn't a story of evil masterminds. It's a story of structure. Mike Benz emphasizes that modern power doesn't need malice. It needs efficiency. NGOs are efficient. They solve problems governments and platforms can't handle openly. The question that changes perspective. By the end of this episode, one question becomes unavoidable. If unelected organizations shape what the public can see, hear, and believe, how democratic is the system really? Joe Rogan doesn't answer it. Mike Benz doesn't answer it. They let the listener sit with it. Because once you see the shadow network, you don't stop seeing it.
The highest value. Mike Benz explains that institutions prioritize stability over transparency. Joe Rogan sees the trade-off immediately. Stability without accountability isn't democracy, it's management. Why people accept it, the most disturbing part of this system, is how willingly people accept it. Why? Because chaos is frightening. Mike Benz explains that when people are told that questioning outcomes threatens democracy itself, many choose silence. Joe reflects on how often people say, "I just want things to be normal again." That desire is powerful and exploitable. Democracy as a feeling elections no longer just decide leadership, they manage public emotion. Mike Benz explains that modern systems focus on making people feel represented, even if their influence is limited. Joe recognizes the pattern. If people feel heard, they stop pushing. The cost of managed democracy. Managed democracy looks calm, orderly, predictable, safe, but it comes at a cost. Reduced debate, narrow discourse, fragile legitimacy. Mike Benz emphasizes that systems afraid of dissent are systems that don't trust their own foundations. Joe sits with that thought. No conspiracy required. This system doesn't require secret meetings. It requires alignment. Platforms want safety. Governments want stability. Media wants credibility. NGOs want relevance. Together, they create an environment where outcomes are shaped without overt manipulation. Joe Rogan realizes something crucial. That makes the system resilient and dangerous. The question that redefines elections. By the end of this discussion, one question becomes unavoidable. If elections are decided by shaping belief rather than counting votes, what exactly are people voting for? Joe doesn't answer it. Mike Benz doesn't answer it. They let it linger. Because once that question exists, elections never feel the same again.
The shift nobody announced. There was no press conference announcing this change. No headline that read, "Welcome to the information war era." Instead, the shift arrived disguised as responsibility. Platforms began talking about safety, trust, integrity, harm reduction. Each word sounded reasonable, necessary even, but as Mike Benz explains, these terms slowly became policy gateways. They allowed decisions about visibility, reach, and legitimacy to be made behind closed doors, without public debate. Joe Rogan raises a critical point. Most people assume censorship means deletion. Benz corrects him. Deletion is crude. Deletion creates backlash. Modern systems don't delete ideas. They derank them. They slow them down. They limit their spread. They quietly remove them from recommendation systems. Nothing feels taken from you. The idea still exists, somewhere. It just stops mattering. When war becomes invisible. Traditional war relies on fear and force. This war relies on normalization. Mike Benz describes how information control works best when it feels boring. When it's technical. When it's framed as maintenance rather than enforcement. Most people don't read platform policy updates. They don't question algorithm changes. They don't track which topics suddenly stop trending. They just adapt. Joe realizes something profound during the conversation. This war doesn't need public support. It only needs public disengagement. If people stop paying attention, the system runs smoothly. And it has. The role of platforms, not villains, not heroes. One of the most important clarifications Benz makes is that platforms themselves aren't necessarily evil. They're pressure points. Governments, NGOs, and institutions realize something crucial. Controlling platforms directly would create backlash, but influencing their incentives would not. Regulatory threats, public pressure, advertiser concerns, reputation risks.
They anticipate pressure. Mike Benz explains that companies learn what governments and institutions expect, then enforce it proactively. Joe sees the danger. That means control happens without orders. Fear does the work. Why nobody pushes back? Joe asks the obvious question, why don't platforms resist? Mike Benz's answer is brutally honest, because resistance is expensive. Regulation, legal threats, public backlash, reputational damage. Compliance is cheaper than courage. Speech as a security risk. One of the biggest shifts discussed is how speech became a security issue. Not illegal speech, not violent speech, just speech that destabilizes narratives. Joe Rogan notices how often officials now talk about information warfare, cognitive security, narrative resilience. These aren't free speech terms, they're military terms. The foreign threat justification. Mike Benz explains how foreign interference became the perfect justification. Once speech is framed as potentially foreign-driven, platforms feel obligated to intervene. Joe connects the dots. If you can label ideas as foreign-influenced, you don't need to debate them, you neutralize them. Automation of control. This isn't done by humans alone. Algorithms decide what trends, what disappears, what never reaches an audience. Joe Rogan points out something unsettling. Algorithms don't need intent, they just follow incentives. Mike Benz agrees. That makes them the perfect tool. Soft censorship works better. Hard censorship creates martyrs. Soft censorship creates silence. Mike Benz explains how reduced reach, shadow bans, demonetization, deranking are more effective than outright bans. Joe realizes why people feel something is wrong but can't prove it, because nothing is visible. The normalization effect. The most powerful part of this system is normalization. People adapt. Creators self-censor. Audiences adjust expectations. Platforms redefine standards. Joe reflects on how many conversations no longer happen at all. Not because they're banned, because they're discouraged. Freedom without reach. Mike Benz delivers one of the most quoted lines from the episode. You can say whatever you want if no one hears you. Joe laughs, then stops, because it's true. Why the system is stable. This system doesn't require constant enforcement. It trains behavior. Once people internalize boundaries, control sustains itself. Joe Rogan recognizes the brilliance and the danger. A system that doesn't need force lasts longer. The cost of digital order. Order feels good, predictable, safe, calm, but Mike Benz warns that order built on managed speech becomes fragile, because when reality breaks through, people feel betrayed. Joe sits with that thought. The question of the future. As this segment closes, one question hangs in the air. If the internet is managed for stability, what happens when truth becomes destabilizing? Neither Joe nor Mike answers, because the answer depends on who holds power. The NGO illusion. How civil society became a tool of invisible power. For decades, NGOs were seen as the good guys, human rights defenders, democracy promoters, voices for the voiceless. Their language was moral, their mission sounded noble, their funding was rarely questioned. But in the Joe Rogan Experience number 2447, Mike Benz introduces a deeply uncomfortable idea. Many modern NGOs don't challenge power, they extend it. And once you see how that system works, you can't unsee it. The trust advantage. Joe Rogan begins this section with an observation that feels obvious in hindsight. People don't trust governments, they don't fully trust corporations, but they do trust NGOs. Mike Benz agrees and explains why that trust is so valuable. NGOs operate with moral authority, media protection, public sympathy that makes them the perfect intermediaries. Joe immediately senses the danger. If power moves through institutions people don't question, it becomes invisible. What civil society really means. Mike Benz explains that civil society sounds organic, grassroots, bottom-up, independent, but in practice, many large NGOs are heavily funded, politically aligned, strategically deployed. Joe reacts, because that means civil society isn't always spontaneous, sometimes it's engineered. The funding question nobody asks. One of the most important moments in this discussion is when Benz asks a simple question: who pays? Large NGOs don't survive on donations alone. They rely on government grants, international institutions, foundations tied to geopolitical interests. Joe Rogan notices the pattern. If funding shapes survival, it also shapes priorities. NGOs as policy laundering machines. Mike Benz introduces a powerful concept: policy laundering. Governments want outcomes they can't openly push. NGOs push them instead. Joe leans in because that means controversial policies can be reframed as human rights demands, civil society concerns, independent advocacy. Same goal, different messenger. Plausible deniability by design. One of the reasons this system is so effective is distance. Governments say, we don't control these groups. NGOs say, we're independent. Media says, experts agree. Joe sees it instantly. No single actor owns responsibility. The system protects itself. Color revolutions and soft power. Mike Benz carefully explains how NGOs became central to soft power strategy. Not coups, not invasions, but protest coordination, narrative framing international pressure campaigns. Joe Rogan recognizes how often media describes unrest as organic. But Benz points out the infrastructure behind it. Training programs, funding pipelines, messaging toolkits. Organic movements don't come with manuals. Human rights as a strategic language. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable. Mike Benz makes it clear. Human rights are real, abuses are real, but the selective enforcement of human rights is strategic. Joe nods slowly. Some countries are constantly condemned, others are ignored. The difference isn't morality, it's alignment. NGOs and media feedback loops. Another key insight is how NGOs and media reinforce each other. NGOs provide reports, experts, statistics, media provides amplification, legitimacy, pressure. Joe notices how often journalists quote NGO reports without questioning funding or incentives. That loop creates authority without accountability. The career incentive problem. Mike Benz explains something most people never consider. NGO leadership is a career path. People move between NGOs, international institutions, government advisory roles, media commentary. Joe reacts. That means independent voices often circulate within the same ecosystem. Different titles, same worldview. When activism becomes infrastructure, at scale, NGOs stop being activists. They become infrastructure. They shape policy agendas, define acceptable discourse, train future leaders. Joe realizes the implication. Once activism becomes institutionalized, it stops challenging power, it manages it. Why this system feels moral? The most dangerous part of this system is that it feels righteous. Mike Benz explains that moral language shuts down scrutiny. If you question funding arrow, you're cynical, motives arrow, you're heartless, strategy arrow, you're dangerous. Joe recognizes how often debate ends there. Morality becomes armor. The NGO Platform Alliance, NGOs, don't operate alone. They partner with platforms to flag content, define harm, advise moderation. Joe Rogan connects this to earlier discussions about digital control. That means NGOs don't just influence governments, they influence speech. Democracy export as influence. One of the most striking ideas in this part of the episode is that democracy promotion often serves foreign policy. Mike Benz explains that exporting democracy often aligns suspiciously well with strategic interests. Joe pauses because democracy should be about self-determination, but influence prefers outcomes when local voices don't matter. In many cases, NGOs speak for populations rather than with them. Mike Benz explains how local dissent is often filtered through international frameworks. Joe sees the problem. That replaces lived experience with approved narratives. Why this isn't a conspiracy? Joe asks an important question. Is this coordinated? Mike Benz answers carefully. No secret room, no master plan. Just incentives, funding, career paths. Shared ideology systems don't need villains. They need alignment. The stability argument returns. Just like with elections and speech, NGOs often justify actions in the name of stability. Mike Benz points out how often disruption is framed as dangerous unless it serves approved goals. Joe recognizes the pattern. Stability always favors those already in power. The illusion of opposition. One of the most unsettling realizations is that some opposition is allowed because it's manageable. NGOs can channel dissent into safe directions. Joe nods. That's better than suppression. It creates the feeling of resistance without risk. the question that changes everything. As this part of the conversation winds down, Mike Benz leaves Joe with a question that reframes everything. If civil society is funded, trained, and guided by power, who actually represents the people? Joe doesn't answer. Because once you ask that question, the system looks very different. The new Cold War of narratives, intelligence agencies, information power, and the battle you never see wars used to be loud. Bombs, troops, borders crossed on maps. You could point to them and say, this is a war. But in the Joe Rogan Experience number 2447, Mike Benz explains that the most important wars today don't look like wars at all. They look like debates. They sound like concern. They move like information, and most people never realize they're standing in the middle of one, when war went quiet. Joe Rogan opens this part of the conversation with a realization that feels unsettling. Everything today feels tense, but nothing feels declared. Mike Benz agrees, because modern conflict doesn't begin with an announcement, it begins with narratives. If you can shape how populations interpret reality, you don't need to fire a shot. Intelligence after the Cold War. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies focused on espionage, military secrets, nuclear capabilities, but when the Cold War ended, something changed. Mike Benz explains that intelligence didn't disappear, it repositioned. Joe leans in as Benz explains the pivot. The new battlefield wasn't territory, it was perception. Information as a strategic asset. One of the most important shifts discussed is how information itself became a weapon. Not fake information alone, but timing, framing, emphasis, silence. Joe Rogan realizes this instantly. Two people can read the same facts and walk away with opposite conclusions. That gap is power. The rise of cognitive warfare. Mike Benz introduces a term most people have never heard. Cognitive warfare. The goal isn't to convince you of something specific. It's to confuse you, exhaust you, polarize you, make trust impossible. Joe reacts strongly, because a confused population is easier to manage than a united one. Intelligence without footprints. Old intelligence operations left traces, spies, wiretaps, documents. Modern operations leave plausible deniability. Narratives spread through media, NGOs, experts, influencers. Joe notices how often opinions appear organically. Mike Benz explains why. If influence looks natural, resistance collapses. The narrative supply chain. One of the most powerful ideas in this section is the concept of a narrative supply chain. Information doesn't appear randomly, it flows from intelligence assessments to policy briefings to NGO reports to media headlines to social media trends. Joe Rogan pauses.
When reality breaks, what happens? When narratives fail, narratives are powerful. They organize chaos. They simplify reality. They give people a story to live inside. But narratives have a weakness. They must eventually face reality. And in the Joe Rogan Experience, number 2447, Mike Benz explains what happens when reality refuses to cooperate, the fragility. Nobody talks about Joe Rogan opens this section with a feeling many people quietly share. Something feels brittle. Societies look stable, but tense. Conversations feel rehearsed, but angry. Mike Benz agrees because systems built on narrative control aren't as strong. They're fragile. They depend on constant reinforcement. Narratives don't age well. One of the first cracks appears with time. Mike Benz explains that narratives are designed for moments, not decades. They simplify, they compress, they omit. Joe nods. Over time, omissions accumulate, and eventually, people notice. The gap between lived experience and official story. The most dangerous moment for any narrative is when people's lived experience contradicts it. Mike Benz explains how this gap forms. People are told the economy is strong, institutions are trusted, systems are working, but they experience instability, insecurity, powerlessness. Joe recognizes the pattern instantly. That disconnect breeds resentment, while suppression accelerates collapse. Joe asks a crucial question: why not just adjust the narrative? Mike Benz explains the trap. Once suppression becomes the response, credibility erodes faster. If people feel they can't talk about what they see, they assume deception. Joe nods. Silence doesn't restore trust, it destroys it. The Streisand effect at scale. Another moment of breakdown comes when suppression draws attention. Mike Benz explains how attempts to hide or downplay issues often amplify them. Joe laughs briefly, then stops, because it's true. What's forbidden becomes fascinating. Trust is the real currency. At this point, Mike Benz reframes the entire discussion. The real resource isn't information, it's trust. Once trust collapses, experts lose authority, media loses influence, institutions lose legitimacy. Joe Rogan sits with that, because rebuilding trust is harder than building narratives. Polarization as a system failure. Most people think polarization is the goal. Mike Benz disagrees. Polarization is a failure state. Joe is surprised. Benz explains. Narrative systems want predictability. Polarization creates volatility. People stop listening, even to approved voices. When everyone becomes a skeptic. One of the unintended consequences of overmanagement is universal skepticism. Mike Benz explains how people stop believing. Official statements, fact checks, clarifications. Joe sees it everywhere. Once people feel manipulated, even truth sounds like suspend. The rise of counter-narratives. When official stories weaken, alternatives emerge. Some are thoughtful, some are reckless, some are dangerous. Mike Benz makes an important distinction. Suppression doesn't eliminate bad ideas. It pushes them underground, where they evolve unchecked. Joe nods. That's how extremes grow. The crisis of meaning beyond politics. Something deeper happens. People lose a shared sense of reality. Mike Benz explains that narratives don't just explain events. They provide meaning. When those collapse, people feel unanchored. Joe recognizes the emotional toll. Anxiety, anger, alienation, emergency powers, and narrative failure. One of the most revealing patterns appears during crises. Mike Benz explains that when narratives fail, authorities escalate. They declare emergencies, exceptional circumstances, temporary measures. Joe immediately sees the danger. Temporary powers rarely feel temporary. The feedback loop of force compensates for lost belief. Mike Benz explains that when persuasion stops working, enforcement begins. Joe nods slowly. That's the moment societies cross a line. Why this moment feels different? Joe asks, what makes now unique? Mike Benz answers carefully. Never before have information spread this fast, trust collapsed this widely. Control been decentralized. Joe realizes the implication. Small failures now scale instantly. The myth of going back. Some people believe things can return to normal. Mike Benz is blunt. There is no going back. Once people see behind the curtain, innocence is gone. Joe agrees. You can't unknow what you know. The choice systems face. At this stage, systems face a fork in the road, adapt or double down. Mike Benz explains that doubling down feels safer in the short term. Joe sees the problem. Short-term stability creates long-term rupture. Why cracks become breaks, small inconsistencies become symbolic. Mike Benz explains how single events, mishandled, ignored, or dismissed, can trigger massive backlash. Joe nods. People don't revolt over one thing. They revolt when everything adds up. The return of reality. No matter how strong narratives are, reality eventually reasserts itself. Economic constraints, demographic changes, geopolitical shifts. Mike Benz emphasizes this point. Narratives can delay consequences. They can't erase them. The danger of a truth vacuum. When official narratives collapse and alternatives are suppressed, a vacuum forms. Mike Benz warns that vacuums attract extremists. Joe understands immediately. If truth disappears, certainty becomes seductive. The question nobody can avoid. As this section closes, Mike Benz leaves Joe with a question that feels unavoidable. When narratives stop working, will institutions choose humility or control? Joe doesn't answer, because history shows what usually comes next. The future of power. What comes after narrative control. Power never disappears. It evolves. When old systems stop working, power doesn't step back. It changes form. And in the Joe Rogan Experience, number 2447, Mike Benz and Joe Rogan circle one final, unavoidable question. If narrative control is reaching its limits, what comes next? The end of the narrative era. Joe Rogan opens the final part of the conversation with a realization that feels heavy. People are tired, not just politically, but mentally. Mike Benz agrees. Narrative saturation has consequences. When everything is framed, managed, and filtered, people stop engaging. Not because they don't care, because they feel played. Control has a half-life. One of the most important insights Benz offers is this. Control systems have a half-life. They work until they don't. Narrative power depends on trust, legitimacy, believability. Once those decay, the system loses efficiency. Joe nods. You can't fact-check your way out of disbelief. From persuasion to enforcement, Mike Benz explains what usually happens next. When persuasion fails, systems shift toward enforcement, not immediately with force, but with regulation, credentialing access, control, permission structures. Joe recognizes the pattern. Speech becomes conditional. Participation becomes gated. The rise of technocratic power. As narratives weaken, technocracy rises. Decisions move away from public debate and toward experts, committees, models, risk assessments. Mike Benz explains why. Technocracy doesn't need belief. It needs compliance. Joe pauses, because compliance doesn't require agreement. Democracy without debate. One of the most unsettling possibilities discussed is a future where democracy exists, but debate doesn't. People still vote, institutions still operate, processes still run, but real choices narrow. Joe Rogan feels the tension immediately. That's democracy in form, not in a spirit. Behavioral governance. Mike Benz introduces the idea of behavioral governance. Instead of telling people what to think, systems nudge behavior, shape incentives, penalize deviation. Joe connects this to digital platforms instantly. Likes, visibility, reach, monetization. You don't have to be banned to be controlled. The scoring society. Another future-facing concern is social and economic scoring. Mike Benz explains that reputation systems are powerful because they feel voluntary. People self-regulate. Joe sees the danger. When access depends on scores, dissent becomes costly. Centralization versus fragmentation. Joe asks whether power will centralize further or fragment. Mike Benz answers carefully, both. Central control over infrastructure, fragmentation among people. That combination creates dependency without unity. Joe nods. Divided populations are easier to manage. The return of hard reality. No system escapes reality forever. Mike Benz explains that economics, demographics, and geopolitics don't respond to narratives. Joe agrees. Debt doesn't care about framing, resources don't care about messaging. When material pressure rises, belief systems crack. Crisis as opportunity for power. Crises accelerate change. Mike Benz explains that moments of breakdown are when new systems are introduced. Joe has seen this before. Emergency justifies transformation. And once introduced, systems rarely retreat. Who gets left out? As systems become more managed, not everyone fits. Mike Benz points out that people who question too much, don't conform, resist categorization, are often excluded rather than debated. Joe feels the weight of that. Exclusion is quieter than repression, the human instinct that never goes away. Despite everything, Benz emphasizes one thing: humans resist being managed forever. People want agency voice, meaning. Joe agrees. You can suppress expression, but not desire. Decentralization as a response. One possible future is decentralization. Mike Benz discusses alternative platforms, parallel institutions, local networks. Joe sees the appeal, but also the risk. Decentralization challenges power, but also cohesion. The danger of overcorrection. Another risk is backlash. When people feel controlled long enough, reactions become extreme. Mike Benz warns that suppressed dissent doesn't disappear. It explodes. Joe nods. Debt doesn't care about framing. Resources don't care about messaging. When material pressure rises, belief systems crack. Crisis as opportunity for power. Crises accelerate change. Mike Benz explains that moments of breakdown are when new systems are introduced. Joe has seen this before. Emergency justifies transformation, and once introduced, systems rarely retreat. Who gets left out? As systems become more managed, not everyone fits. Mike Benz points out that people who question too much, don't conform, resist categorization, are often excluded rather than debated. Joe feels the weight of that. Exclusion is quieter than repression, the human instinct that never goes away. Despite everything, Benz emphasizes one thing: humans resist being managed forever. People want agency voice. Meaning Joe agrees you can suppress expression, but not desire. Decentralization as a response. One possible future is decentralization. Mike Benz discusses alternative platforms, parallel institutions, local networks. Joe sees the appeal, but also the risk. Decentralization challenges power, but also cohesion, the danger of overcorrection. Another risk is backlash. When people feel controlled long enough, reactions become extreme. Mike Benz warns that suppressed dissent doesn't disappear. It explodes. Joe nods. History supports that. The role of individuals. Joe asks the most personal question of the entire episode. What can individuals do? Mike Benz answers simply: stay curious, resist emotional manipulation, value truth over belonging. Joe smiles. That's harder than it sounds. Awareness as the first break. The most powerful moment of the finale is quiet. Mike Benz says the system depends on people not seeing it. Once seen, it must adapt. Joe lets that sit. Awareness doesn't topple power, but it forces change. No villain, no savior. There isn't a story with heroes and villains. Mike Benz is clear about that. It's a story about systems. And systems don't have morals. They have incentives. Joe nods. That makes the problem harder and more honest. The question that defines the future. As the conversation reaches its end, one final question remains: if people no longer trust narratives, but still need meaning, what fills the gap? Joe doesn't answer. Mike Benz doesn't answer. Because that answer hasn't been written yet. The uncomfortable truth power will continue, but it will look different, less visible, more technical, more conditional. Mike Benz leaves Joe and the audience with a final thought. The future won't be decided by who controls the story. It will be decided by who controls access to platforms, access to resources, access to participation. Joe Rogan sits silently for a moment because that future feels closer than anyone wants to admit. The end and the beginning. This isn't an ending, it's a threshold. Once you understand how power actually works, you can't go back to comforting myths. You can only decide how consciously you live inside the system, and whether you accept management or insist on agency.